The cup slipped from her fingers so slowly that she had time to watch it fall. It hit the kitchen floor with a crack that sounded to her ears like something inside her chest. The coffee spread across the tiles in a dark, widening stain, and Margaret stood there, barefoot, holding the dish towel she had been using to wipe down the counter. And she did not move. She just stood there, staring at the broken ceramic pieces, at the coffee soaking into the grout, and she breathed. She had known for 11 weeks, 11 weeks of making breakfast for a man who smelled like someone else's perfume when he came home late. 11 weeks of sitting across from her best friend at Sunday dinners, watching the way Diane laughed a little too loudly when Robert made a joke, watching the way Diane's fingers brushed her husband's when they both reached for the bread basket, watching the tiny flinch Diane made every time Margaret looked at her directly. 11 weeks of knowing and saying nothing. People would ask her later why she waited, why she smiled, why she kept cooking the Sunday roasts and organizing the neighborhood book club and driving her daughter to dance practice and acting like the woman she had always been. And the answer was not simple. It was never simple, but what no one in that kitchen, in that neighborhood, in that careful, polished life could possibly have known was that Margaret had a plan. Not the plan of a bitter woman, not the plan of a woman destroyed, the plan of someone who had been underestimated her entire life and had learned, very quietly, to use that. She picked up the broken cup. She wiped the floor. She put the kettle back on. And she smiled at nothing in particular, at the empty kitchen, at the morning light coming through the window she had chosen herself 18 years ago when they first looked at this house, when she had stood in this very spot and said, yes, this is the one, I can feel it. She had felt things her whole life, that was her gift and her curse. She felt things before they happened, felt them in the air, in the small shift of a person's eyes, in the half-second pause before someone answered a question that should have been easy. She had felt it the first time 3 months ago on a Thursday evening, when Robert came home and kissed her cheek, and she noticed he was wearing a different cologne than he had left with. She had felt it 2 weeks later when Diane called, and her voice was too warm, too bright, too deliberately cheerful, in the way that voices get when they are covering something heavy underneath. But if you think this story is about a woman who fell apart, you are watching the wrong channel. This is the story of what Margaret did next. Margaret Louise Caldwell had grown up in a small town in rural Ohio where people knew your business before you did and held it against you anyway. She was the second of 4 children born to a woman who cleaned houses for a living and a man who drove trucks across state lines and came home tired and quiet and sometimes not at all. There was never quite enough money, but there was always quite enough pride, and her mother had raised her children on that pride, the way other mothers raised theirs on vitamins and after-school programs. Her mother's name was Ruth, and Ruth Caldwell cleaned the houses of people who never once learned her last name. To them, she was Ruth the housekeeper, Ruth who came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, Ruth who knew where everything was and never touched the personal things on the desk and always left a little note when she used the last of the cleaning spray so someone could reorder it. Ruth who had raised 4 children and buried a husband and kept her back straight through all of it. Margaret had watched her mother her whole childhood and made herself 2 promises. The first was that she would get out of that town. The second was that she would never let anyone look through her the way they looked through her mother. She kept both promises, more or less. She got out. She went to community college and then transferred to a 4-year university and studied accounting, because numbers were something no one could argue with, and she had always liked things that could not be disputed. She met Robert Caldwell at a work event when she was 26, a corporate mixer where she had gone with a colleague and felt entirely out of place, and was standing near the drinks table eating a canapé she did not particularly enjoy when he walked over and said without any introduction that he could tell she was the smartest person in the room. She had laughed at that. She had said, That's a line. And he had said, I know, but it's also true. She married him 3 years later. They moved to the suburb of Columbus that everyone called nice, meaning it was quiet and had good schools, and the neighbors waved from their driveways. They had their daughter Clara, who was now 15 and tall and serious and read too much and reminded Margaret in ways that were sometimes painful of herself at that age. They had built a life, a good life, a real one. And then there was Diane. Diane Marsh had been Margaret's best friend for 9 years. They had met at a neighborhood barbecue, one of those August afternoons where everyone is slightly too hot and slightly too cheerful about it, and Diane had come over to where Margaret was standing, also slightly removed from the main group, and said without preamble, "Do you ever notice that everyone at these things is performing happiness rather than actually experiencing it?" And Margaret had looked at her and felt immediately, instinctively, that this was a person worth knowing. Diane was warm and funny and catastrophically intelligent. She had a laugh that started low and built, a real laugh, not a polite one. She was a graphic designer who worked from home and had a studio in her back bedroom where the walls were covered in color swatches and half-finished projects and sticky notes that said things like, "Does this feel like Tuesday, or does this feel like grief?" She was the kind of person who brought wine to difficult conversations and tissues to happy ones, because she always knew which kind of crying was which. She was also, it turned out, in love with Robert. Margaret had found out on a Tuesday. It was early March, one of those grey Ohio days where the sky looks like someone forgot to finish it, and she had come home from the grocery store to find Robert's car in the driveway at 2 in the afternoon when he should have been at work. She had not thought much of it at first. Sometimes he worked from home. She had carried in the first 2 bags of groceries, set them on the counter, and gone back for the third. On the way back across the garage, she had glanced through the window of her own car, caught her own reflection, and something stopped her. Not a noise, not a movement, just a feeling, the particular kind of silence that is not empty but full. She had stood very still. Then she had taken out her phone, not to call anyone, not to do anything dramatic, but simply to give her hands something to hold, and she had walked quietly to the side door, the one that opened from the garage into the mudroom, and she had stood there, and she had heard very clearly Diane's laugh, low, building, real. She had stood in the mudroom for 43 seconds. She knew because she counted, because when she was afraid her brain always grabbed onto something concrete, something with edges. 43 seconds. Then she heard Robert's voice, muffled but unmistakably his, and then a silence that was its own kind of answer. And then she had walked back to the garage, got in her car, sat for 4 minutes, and drove to the parking lot of the public library 2 miles away, where she sat for another 20 minutes, looking at the steering wheel. And when she drove home, both cars were where they should be. Robert's in the driveway, no other car on the street. The house looked exactly the way it always did. She had walked inside. She had put away the groceries. She had started dinner. She had not said a single word. Now, in the weeks that followed, what most people would have found impossible was not actually the knowing. It was the pretending not to know in a way that served a purpose. Margaret had learned a very specific kind of patience from her mother, from watching Ruth Caldwell operate in houses that belonged to other people, navigating around egos and assumptions with the grace of someone who had no choice but to be smarter than the room she was cleaning. Her mother had never said, "Be quiet, because you are less." Her mother had said, "Be quiet, because you are watching." There is a difference. The quiet of defeat and the quiet of strategy look exactly the same from the outside. That was the thing people never understood. By the 4th week, she had confirmed what she already knew. Not through anger, not through confrontation, not through going through his phone in a panicked frenzy at midnight. She had done it with the same methodical calm she brought to quarterly reports. She had noted things, small things. The slight change in how he sat when he came home on certain evenings, looser and more open, in a way she recognized as the particular physical ease of a person who has recently been seen and validated. The Tuesdays and Thursdays when he stayed late at work, which coincidentally were Diane's days, which Margaret knew because she had for 9 years known her best friend's schedule the way you know a sister's. The text message she had glimpsed accidentally, truly accidentally, while Robert was in the shower and his phone lit up on the nightstand, and the name at the top was Diane, and the 3 words visible in the preview were enough. Enough and more than enough. She had put his phone back exactly where it was, screen down. She had walked to Clara's room and knocked and said, "Are you hungry? I was thinking of making that pasta you like." And Clara had looked up from her book and said, "Yes, please," and gone back to reading. And Margaret had stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her daughter's profile, the serious set of her jaw, the way she held a book with both hands like it might escape, and something in her chest had pulled tight and then released. Not tonight, she had thought. Not yet. What she was building took longer than anger. Anger was fast and bright, and it burned things down, and burning things down was easy. Anyone could do it. What Margaret was doing required architecture. It required a blueprint. She called her accountant friend Vera, a woman she had gone to university with and trusted completely and seen perhaps twice a year for the last decade. She'd called her on a Saturday morning when Robert was at the gym and Clara was still asleep, and she had said, "Vera, I need you to help me understand some things about marital finances and what protections a woman in my situation might want to have in place." And Vera, who was a sharp and worldly woman who had seen her share of situations, had said, "Tell me everything and I will tell you what matters." She had told Vera everything, or almost everything. Enough. And Vera had said, "First of all, I'm so sorry." And then she had said, "Now listen carefully, because this is what you need to know. If you are watching this, and you have ever sat in a kitchen alone with something you were not ready to say out loud, if you have ever swallowed something enormous and just kept going through your day, just kept making dinner and answering emails and smiling at people who did not deserve your smile, then you already understand a little of what Margaret was feeling in those weeks. And if you are feeling what I am feeling right now, that mix of heartbreak and something that is not quite anger, but is close to it and is also a strange and unexpected pride, go ahead and hit that like button, because this story is far from over. And what comes next is going to leave you completely breathless. There is something I have not told you yet. Something about Diane that will change the shape of everything you have heard so far. Something that Margaret herself did not know, not in those first weeks, not even as she was building her careful and patient plan. Something that would come out in the 7th week, on a rainy Wednesday evening, in a way that made Margaret Caldwell sit down on the floor of her bathroom and press her back against the tub and close her eyes and feel the world rearrange itself around her. But first, you need to understand what Wednesday dinners were like. Every Wednesday for 5 years, Margaret and Diane had dinner together. Sometimes Robert was there, sometimes not. But the two women had carved out this particular ritual as their own, rotating between their 2 houses, cooking together or ordering in, drinking wine and talking about everything and nothing the way that only very old friendships can. They talked about their children, their work, their mothers, their fears, their bodies getting older in ways they had not expected to mind, and found they did a little. They talked about books and about dreams they had not quite given up, and about the particular exhaustion of being a certain kind of woman in a certain kind of world. Margaret had not cancelled Wednesday dinners. She had kept going. She had sat across from Diane at Diane's kitchen table, had eaten Diane's pasta and drunk Diane's wine, had laughed at Diane's stories, had offered her own. She had watched Diane's eyes. She had watched the way Diane reached for her glass and held it just a second too long. She had watched the flinch, always that flinch, when Margaret looked at her directly and held the eye contact just a beat past comfortable. She had watched Diane work so hard to be normal that the effort of it was almost painful to see, and still she had said nothing. On the 6th Wednesday, Diane had suddenly said, out of nowhere, in the middle of a conversation about a television show they were both watching, "Do you ever feel like you have made a mistake so large that there is no way back from it?" And Margaret had looked at her, really looked at her, and said, "What kind of mistake?" And Diane had shaken her head and said, "Never mind, it's nothing, I'm being dramatic," and had poured more wine and changed the subject, and Margaret had let her. Because she was watching, because she was still watching. It was in the 7th week, on the rainy Wednesday, that everything shifted. Diane had called that afternoon and said she was not feeling well and could they postpone the dinner. Her voice had sounded different, tight, like a string wound too far. Margaret had said, of course, and had meant to leave it there. She had meant to let it go, let the evening close quietly, make herself a simple dinner and read and go to bed at a decent hour. But something had sat wrongly in her chest all afternoon. That feeling again, the feeling she had learned never to ignore. Not a dramatic alarm, just a low, persistent hum of wrongness, like a radiator with a small leak somewhere. At 7 in the evening, she had driven to Diane's house. She did not call first. She did not know exactly why. Later, she would say it was instinct. She would say she had just wanted to check on her friend. Both of those things were true. Diane lived in a house 4 streets away, a smaller house, a cheerful house with window boxes and a red front door that she repainted every 2 years because she said a person needed at least one thing in their life they could change on purpose just for beauty. Margaret had been to that red door hundreds of times. She walked up to it now in the rain, which was the thin, cold March rain that was not quite committed to being anything in particular, and she rang the bell, and she waited. It took Diane a long time to answer. When she did, she was wearing clothes she had clearly been crying in. Her eyes were swollen. Her hair was pushed back from her face in a way that was not quite disheveled but was close. She looked at Margaret in the doorway, and her face did something complicated, something that moved through surprise and guilt and relief and grief, all in the span of about 2 seconds, and then settled on a kind of exhausted openness, like a door that had been held shut for too long and had finally simply given up. She said, "I was wondering when you were going to come," and Margaret said, "I brought wine," and Diane stepped back and let her in. They sat in Diane's living room, which was all warm colors and mismatched lamps and cushions and the general beautiful chaos of a person who lived inside their own creativity. They sat for a long time without saying much. Margaret poured the wine. Outside, the rain picked up. The lamp in the corner made a circle of orange light. Then Diane said, "You know, don't you?" It was not a question. Margaret looked at her. She said, "Yes," and Diane put her face in her hands. What came next was not what Margaret had expected. She had imagined, in the weeks of silence, how this conversation might go. She had run through versions of it in the small hours of the night when she could not sleep, had cast herself in various roles: the wounded wife, the cold judge, the woman who walked out, the woman who screamed. She had never quite imagined this, the two of them sitting in the lamplight with the rain outside, and Diane crying in a way that was clearly not performance, clearly not strategy, clearly not anything other than the sound a person makes when they have been carrying something that was too heavy for too long. She had never imagined that Diane would say what she said next. Diane lifted her face from her hands. Her eyes were red and her cheeks were wet, and she looked, Margaret thought, like someone who had been underwater and had just broken the surface. She said, "Margaret, there is something I need to tell you. Something that has nothing to do with Robert. Something I have been trying to find a way to tell you for 2 months, and I have been a coward about it, and I am ashamed, and I need you to hear it." Margaret said, "Tell me." Diane said, "I'm sick." The rain on the windows, the lamp in the corner, the wine in the glasses that neither of them was drinking anymore, and those 2 words sitting between them, like something that had fallen and broken and could not be put back together in its original shape. "I'm sick," Diane said again, as if saying it twice made it more or less real. She was not sure which. "I found out 10 weeks ago. Breast cancer. Stage 2, they think, though the last biopsy results are not back yet, and I have been absolutely terrified to see what they say. I have been going to appointments by myself because I did not know how to tell anyone. I have been driving to the hospital and sitting in waiting rooms with my coat on my lap, and then coming home and acting like nothing was happening, and I think I have been losing my mind." Margaret set down her glass very carefully. She said, 10 weeks ago. She said it like a person doing arithmetic they did not want to do. 10 weeks. And Diane had started coming to Wednesday dinners with that flinch in her eyes. 10 weeks, and something had changed in the air between them. 10 weeks, and something had been wrong that Margaret had been certain she understood. She said, "Diane, are you and Robert?" And Diane looked at her with an expression that was half confusion and half fresh anguish and said, "What? No. God, no. Margaret, why would you?" And something in the room shifted. The kind of shift that happens when you have been looking at a picture for weeks and been certain you understood it, and then someone tilts it slightly and you realize you were seeing it upside down the entire time. Margaret said very quietly, "I heard you in my house 3 months ago, on a Tuesday afternoon." Diane stared at her. Margaret said, "I heard your laugh." I heard Robert's voice. Diane said, "Margaret, that was." She stopped. She pressed her hand over her mouth. Then she said, "We were talking. We were just talking in your kitchen. I had come to see you and you weren't home yet, and he was there and I." She stopped again. She closed her eyes. "Margaret, I had just gotten the diagnosis that morning. I was walking around the neighborhood trying to make myself go home and not fall apart in the street, and I ended up at your door, and Robert was there, and he was kind to me, and I cried, and he made me tea. That is what you heard. I'm sorry. I should have told you. I should have told you that day. I was just so terrified, and I didn't want to say it out loud to anyone yet, because I thought if I said it out loud, it would be real." The room was very quiet. Margaret's heart was doing something she did not have words for. It was not quite relief. It was not quite grief. It was not quite shame, though there was something of shame in it, the particular ache of realizing you have looked at someone you love and seen the worst instead of the truth. It was all of those things, and none of them precisely, and it was also, underneath all of it, enormous. She felt enormous things moving through her, the way weather moves, the way something that has been held in one position for a long time finally releases. She thought about the 43 seconds in the mudroom. She thought about the parking lot of the public library. She thought about every Wednesday evening of the past 11 weeks, sitting across from this woman, watching her flinch and ache and perform normalcy with the desperate energy of someone who is drowning quietly and trying not to frighten the people on shore. She thought about what she had assumed, what she had been so certain of. She had been watching, yes. She had been patient and careful and strategic and all the things her mother had raised her to be, but she had watched through the lens of her own fear and her own wound, and she had seen what she was afraid of seeing, and she had called that certainty. She thought about Robert who had been home in the middle of the day, Robert who had made tea for a frightened woman and let her cry in their kitchen. Robert who had come home that evening and kissed her cheek, and she had smelled his skin for something that wasn't there and found nothing at all, and had told herself she was missing it. She thought about the text message on the nightstand, the 3 words visible in the preview. She had read them as 3 words that meant one thing, and she had not considered for a single moment that they might mean something else entirely. She put her face in her hands. This was not the story she had been telling herself. This was a completely different story. Diane said, "Margaret, are you okay?" And Margaret made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and said, "I owe you an apology." And Diane said, "What? Why?" And Margaret looked up and said, "I thought." She stopped. "I thought something terrible about you and Robert. For 11 weeks. I was so sure. I built a hole." She stopped again. She pressed her lips together. She said, "I was planning things. I had called a lawyer's office. I'd been talking to Vera." Diane stared at her. Then she said, "Oh, Margaret." And that was all she said. Just those 2 words with everything in them. The tenderness and the sorrow and the absurdity and the love, all in 2 words. And then, because they were who they were, because they had been friends for 9 years and had talked about everything and loved each other through the ordinary disasters of life, they both started to cry, and then they both started impossibly to laugh, and then they were both crying and laughing at the same time in the lamplight with the rain coming down outside, which is a particular kind of moment that only happens between people who know each other all the way down. Share this with someone who needs to hear this today. Share it with someone you love, someone who might be sitting in their own silence right now, carrying something they think they have to carry alone. And if you have not subscribed to this channel yet, do it now, because every single week there is a story here that will remind you what people are actually capable of when they stop performing and start being real with each other. Do it now, because what happens next in this story is something I genuinely did not see coming, and I have been sitting with it for weeks. What happened next in this story is that Margaret Caldwell, who had built a plan of quiet and careful revenge for 11 weeks, discovered that she did not need to dismantle the plan at all. She just needed to redirect it, because while she had been planning for the wrong battle, some of the work she had done was exactly the right work. And there was still a reckoning coming, just not the one she had imagined. In the days after that rainy Wednesday, Margaret moved through her life with a different quality of attention. The particular sharpness she had been carrying for 11 weeks, that bright, cold edge of suspicion and strategy, it did not disappear. It transformed. It became something warmer and more directed. She was still watching. She was still thinking. But she was watching the right things now. She watched her husband. Properly, not as evidence, but as a person. And what she saw disturbed her, but not in the way she had expected to be disturbed. Robert had been distant. He had been coming home tired in a way that was different from regular tiredness, the way that people get tired not from exertion, but from weight. He had been sitting with his phone at the kitchen table in the evenings in a way that was not quite secretive, but was not quite open either, the way a person looks when they are worried about something and not sure how to bring it into the conversation. He had been shorter with Clara, not unkind, never unkind with Clara, but less patient, which was unusual for a man who had always had enormous reserves of patience for his daughter. He had been waking in the night. She had noticed it through the light sleep she'd been keeping for weeks, this restless turning beside her, and once she had heard him in the kitchen at 3 a.m, just the quiet sounds of the refrigerator opening, a glass of water, the silence of a person sitting alone with something they were carrying. She thought about what Vera had told her on that Saturday morning. Vera had said a lot of practical things, good and important things, about asset protection and documentation and what a woman needed to ensure for herself in situations of marital breach. But she had also said something else. She had said, "Margaret, before you do anything, make sure you actually know what you know. Not what you feel. Not what you fear. what you know for a fact, because the worst thing you can do is build a case for a crime that hasn't been committed. She had thought that was just lawyer's caution, generic advice. She understood now that it was a lifeline. She called Vera on a Thursday morning and said, "I need to update you." And she told Vera what she had learned, what Diane had told her. And Vera was quiet for a moment and then said, "And you believe her?" And Margaret said, "Yes, I believe her completely. I know the difference." And Vera said, "Okay, then what do you actually want to do?" It was the right question, the best possible question. What did she actually want to do? She wanted to understand what was wrong with Robert, because something was wrong with Robert. She had been so occupied with the story she had convinced herself she was in that she had not looked at the actual story clearly. And the actual story, she was beginning to realize, might be something she was not prepared for. She decided to ask him, directly, not as an interrogation, not as the opening move in a confrontation she had been rehearsing. Just as herself, his wife of 15 years, who had noticed something and wanted to know what it was. She picked a Sunday evening after Clara had gone to her room. The house was quiet. She had made the dinner he liked, nothing elaborate, just the roast chicken and the particular potatoes he always said were better than any restaurant. And they had eaten together and talked about ordinary things, and then she had poured them both some tea, and she had sat down across from him at the kitchen table, and she had said, "Robert, something is wrong, and I need you to tell me what it is." He looked at her. Something moved across his face. It was not guilt exactly, though there was something of that. It was more like relief, the specific relief of someone who has been waiting to be asked. He said, "How long have you known?" She said, "I've known something was wrong for months." "What is it?" He put his hands flat on the table. He looked at them. He was quiet for long enough that she counted again, because her brain always needed something with edges. She counted to 32. He said, "I've been having some health concerns." "For about 4 months." She stared at him. He said, "I've been going to see a specialist for some irregularities in my heart. Nothing that's been conclusive yet. I don't want you to." He stopped. He said, "I didn't want to worry you. I didn't want to say it out loud until I knew what it was. I've been doing tests and the results have been inconclusive, and every time I think I'm going to have something definitive to tell you, they say we need another look. And I've been managing it by myself, and I know that was wrong, but I didn't know how to bring it into our life without." He stopped again. She said, "Without what?" He said, "Without everything feeling different, without you looking at me differently, without scaring Clara." She sat very still. She thought about a Tuesday afternoon and 43 seconds in a mudroom. She thought about a parking lot outside a public library. She thought about calling Vera, calling a lawyer's office, building a case, maintaining a plan. She thought about her husband, driving to a specialist's office alone, sitting in a waiting room with his coat on his lap. She thought about Diane, doing exactly the same thing. 2 people who loved her, both terrified, both swallowing something enormous and trying not to let it leak into the ordinary light of everyday life. Both of them sitting in their separate silences, not knowing the other was doing the same thing, not knowing that the woman between them was in her own silence too, watching them both through a lens that had been bent by fear. She thought about what her mother used to say. She used to say that the problem with being watchful was that you could see so much that you forgot to look. Seeing and looking were different things. Seeing was passive. It was what happened when light hit your eyes. Looking was a choice. Looking meant you directed your attention with intention, with care, with the willingness to be wrong about what you had thought you were seeing. Margaret Caldwell had spent 11 weeks seeing. She had been so diligent about it, so careful and methodical and patient, and she had missed almost entirely the actual landscape of her own life. She reached across the table and took her husband's hands in hers. She said, "We are going to the next appointment together." He said, "Margaret," she said, "I'm not asking. We're going together. Whatever this is, we face it together. That's not a discussion." He looked at her with the expression she recognized from the early years, from the year they were dating and then the year they were engaged and the early years of marriage when everything was still being built. That expression of someone looking at a person they cannot quite believe they have the luck to know. He said, "I've been so afraid." She said, "I know. Me too. Just not about what I thought I was afraid about." She did not tell him then about the 11 weeks. That was a conversation for later, for when the medical picture was clearer and they had more ground under their feet. It was not avoidance. It was sequencing. She was still, after everything, the woman who knew when to speak and when to wait. The difference was that she was now using that skill for truth instead of for survival. She called Diane the next morning. She said, "I talked to Robert." Diane said, "How did it go?" Margaret said, "Did you know about his heart?" There was a pause. Then Diane said, "He told me that afternoon. In your kitchen, over the tea. That's what we were talking about. He had just gotten a call from the specialist that morning." He was. "Margaret, he was in a state. I held his hand for a few minutes and told him he had to tell you. I told him he was being an idiot about this, and that you were stronger than he was treating you. He said he knew. He said he just needed a few more days to figure out how to say it." Margaret said, "Why didn't you tell me?" Diane said, "Because I promised him I wouldn't. Because he was terrified, and I thought he deserved to choose the moment. I'm sorry. I've been thinking about that every single day, whether I made the right call. I still don't know." Margaret said, "You were being a good friend, to both of us." Diane said, "I was trying." There was a silence. The comfortable kind, the kind that old friendships can hold without anything needing to be said inside it. Then Margaret said, "Diane, I am going to be at every single one of your appointments, whatever you need, whatever comes back in those biopsy results. I am going to be there, and you are not going to sit in a waiting room alone again. Do you understand me?" Diane made a sound on the phone that was recognizably the beginning of the building laugh, and then it became something else, something softer, and she said, "Margaret Caldwell." Margaret said, "Yes?" Diane said, "You are the most frightening and wonderful person I have ever known." In the weeks that followed, 3 lives were reorganized around truth rather than assumption, and the reorganization was not painless. It was not a swift and simple rehabilitation. It was the slow, careful work of people who had been carrying things in the wrong directions, finding out how to put them down and pick up what actually needed carrying. The biopsy results came back. Stage 2, as the doctors had suspected, which was frightening and was also, according to the oncologist, very much treatable. Diane began chemotherapy in April, on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Margaret drove her every single time. They sat in the treatment center together, with bad coffee in thin paper cups, and Diane's noise-cancelling headphones, and whatever audiobook they were both currently interested in. And sometimes they talked, and sometimes they did not, and either way, it was the presence that mattered, the simple fact of a hand to hold, if the hand was needed. Robert's cardiac situation resolved itself, partially and imperfectly, but sufficiently. The irregularities, it turned out, were related to a condition that was manageable with medication and lifestyle changes, not the worst case he had been imagining in his most frightened private hours. He started the medication. He started walking in the evenings. He and Margaret began something they had not done in years, walking together after dinner, just around the neighborhood, just the two of them talking. At first the conversations were careful, then they became less so. The whole truth came out in pieces, the way truths generally do, not in one dramatic revelation, but in increments, in the quiet exchanges of people who are learning each other again. She told him about the mudroom. She told him about the parking lot. She told him about calling Vera, about the conversation that had started down a particular road before the story changed. She told him all of it. She owed him that, because she would have wanted it, because marriages survive on the willingness to say even the things that are hard to admit. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a full walk around the block, which was about 1.5 miles, and she let him have that. She was good at silence. She had always been good at silence. When he finally spoke, he said, "I understand why you thought what you thought." She said, "Do you?" He said, "I was behaving like a man with a secret, because I did have a secret, not the one you thought, but still. I closed myself off from you for months, and I left you to fill in the blanks, and I can't be surprised that you filled them in a particular way. That's on me." She said, "It's on me too. I should have asked. I should have come to you." He said, "We've been married 15 years and we forgot to talk to each other." She said, "We're talking now." He said, "Yes, we are." Clara, who was 15 and serious and read too much and understood more than she was given credit for, came to her mother one evening while Margaret was in the kitchen and said, "Is everything okay? With you and Dad? And with Diane?" She said it simply, without dramatics, in the direct way she had always had, looking at her mother with those 2 old eyes. Margaret looked at her daughter for a long moment. She said, "Things have been hard for a few months, for different reasons than you might think. But we are finding our way through it." Clara said, "Diane is going to be okay." Margaret said, "We believe so." The doctors are cautiously optimistic, which is a maddening phrase but also a real one. Clara said, "And you and Dad?" Margaret said, "Yes. We just had to remember how to be honest with each other, which is something you have to keep practicing even when you've been married a long time, maybe especially then." Clara looked at her with an expression that was so precisely like her grandmother Ruth's expression that Margaret felt it like a physical thing in her chest. Clara said, "Grandma Ruth used to say that people who stop talking to each other always think it's the other person's fault." Margaret said she did. She said it constantly. Clara said she was right, wasn't she? Margaret said she almost always was. There is a thing that happens in a life when you have been moving in a wrong direction and you change course. It is not a sudden healing. It is not a dramatic reversal followed by immediate peace. It is something quieter and stranger than that. It is the gradual return of small pleasures, the morning coffee tasting like itself again, the sound of your husband's voice on the phone having its normal warmth, rather than the particular quality of a thing being monitored. Your best friend's laugh, low and building and real, arriving through the phone while you sit in your car outside the grocery store and feeling not like evidence of anything but simply like itself, like the laugh of someone you love who is fighting hard and still finding things to laugh about. Margaret returned to the book club. She organized it, actually, for the first time in 2 years. She chose the book, a novel about a woman who had made a series of reasonable decisions that turned out to be built on an incorrect understanding of her own life and who had to go back and examine each one. She did not choose it to be pointed. She chose it because it felt true to something she was working through. The other women in the book club, who ranged in age from their 40s to their early 70s, who were teachers and retired nurses, and a woman who had sold her small business at 62 and was spending the proceeds on travel, they read it and loved it and discussed it for 3 hours with the particular intensity that women bring to a book that has found something real. One of the women, Pat, who was 68 and had grey hair she wore in a long braid and had been widowed 6 years ago and described herself as still in progress, said, "The thing about this woman is that she's not stupid. She's not even wrong exactly. She's just working with incomplete information, and she thinks it's complete. And Margaret said, yes, that's exactly it. And everyone around the table nodded, and some of them had expressions that suggested they were not only talking about the book. She thought about her mother a great deal in those months. She thought about Ruth Caldwell cleaning other people's houses and keeping her back straight and raising her children on pride when there was not enough of anything else. She thought about what it meant to be a woman who moved quietly through spaces that did not fully belong to her, who observed, who stored, who understood things without being asked to demonstrate the understanding. Her mother had done that out of necessity. Margaret had inherited the habit and had used it sometimes well and sometimes not. The thing about quiet watching she was beginning to understand was that it was only a virtue if it was in service of the truth. If you watched in service of your own fear, if you curated your observations to confirm what you were already certain of, then the skill became a trap. Her mother had watched to survive. Margaret had watched to control, or rather to have the illusion of control, which was a very different thing and considerably less useful. She thought about the 43 seconds in the mudroom. She thought about them the way you think about a moment that could have split your life in a different direction and didn't, and the complex feeling of gratitude mixed with the humbling recognition of how close it was. 43 seconds, and she had walked back to her car. What if she had stayed? What if she had opened that door? She would have seen her best friend sitting at her kitchen table with tears on her face, and her husband making tea, and her whole life would have detonated on an entirely false foundation. The thought of it sat in her stomach like something cold, not just the injustice of it, but the narrowness of it, the terrifying arbitrariness of how lives could turn on 43 seconds, and a decision made in fear. She talked to Vera again, this time not to build a case, but to close one. Vera, who was a practical and decent woman, said she was glad it had worked out, and made a point of noting that the information Margaret had gathered was not wasted, that knowing your own financial position in a marriage was not a bad thing regardless of context. She said, "It is never wrong to understand your own life, Margaret. Just make sure you're understanding it and not narrating it." Margaret thought about that for weeks, the difference between understanding your life and narrating it. When you narrated, you cast, you assigned roles, you built a story with a particular shape, and then looked for evidence that the shape was right. When you understood, you observed without the need for a particular ending, you stayed open to the possibility that the picture was more complicated than your fear wanted it to be. She was still learning the difference. She suspected she would be learning it for the rest of her life. Diane finished her first round of chemotherapy in late June. The results were good. The doctors were genuinely optimistic now, not just cautiously so. There was more treatment ahead, there would always be more monitoring and more checkups, and the particular ongoing anxiety of a person whose body has demonstrated that it can turn against itself. But the prognosis was as good as anyone could have hoped for. On the day the results came back, Margaret was there, sitting in the oncologist's office, while the doctor explained the findings. And she held Diane's hand throughout, and when they walked out into the parking lot, Diane turned to her and said, "You know you saved my life, right?" Margaret said. "The doctors saved your life," Diane said. "The doctors treated my cancer. You saved my life. There's a difference." And Margaret, who was not a woman who cried easily, or at least who had not allowed herself to be for a very long time, felt something give way behind her eyes, and let it. They stood in a hospital parking lot in Ohio in the late afternoon of a June day. Two women in their late 40s who had known each other for 9 years and nearly lost each other to a silence neither of them had known how to break, and they held on to each other for a long time. Around them, the world did its ordinary things. Cars passed, someone pushed a wheelchair toward the entrance, the light changed twice at the intersection. A child in a nearby car pressed its face against the window and looked out at them with the frank curiosity of someone who does not yet understand that certain kinds of holding on are private and sacred and should not be disturbed. The child looked for a long time, then waved. Neither of them saw it. In August, on a Saturday afternoon, with a sky that was properly blue for the first time all summer, Margaret drove to the suburb of Dayton, where her mother was now living in an assisted living facility that was, by the standards of such places, genuinely nice. It had a garden and a cat that belonged to no one officially and to everyone practically, and the staff knew all the residents by name, and the food was not exceptional but was not terrible. And Ruth Caldwell had a room with a window and a view of the garden, and had declared herself with characteristic directness comfortable enough. Margaret sat with her mother in the garden. Ruth was 81 now, and smaller than she had once been, though she had not lost the straightness of the back. She wore a blue cardigan she had had for at least 15 years, and did not see any reason to replace. She drank her tea in the way she always had, both hands around the cup, looking out at whatever was in front of her with the expression of someone who has thought about most things and arrived at a workable arrangement with them. Margaret told her everything, the whole story, beginning to end, the mudroom, the parking lot, Vera, the plan that had been building in the wrong direction. The rainy Wednesday, Diane's diagnosis, Robert's heart, the realignment of everything. She told it all, beginning to end, without editing it to make herself look better, which she thought her mother would have found out anyway. Ruth listened without interrupting. She drank her tea. She watched the garden. The cat came and sat near their feet for a while, and then left on its own business. When Margaret finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So you were watching?" Margaret said yes. Ruth said, "And you saw what you were afraid of instead of what was there?" Margaret said yes. Ruth said, "I used to do that too." Margaret looked at her. Ruth said, "In the houses I cleaned, I used to look at those families and see what I expected to see. The man who was too generous with his compliments, I decided he was up to something. The wife who was too cheerful, I decided she was miserable. I had a whole story about every house I worked in. Took me years to understand that I was writing those stories because it gave me a feeling of control. If I already knew what was wrong, then nothing could surprise me. If I had already imagined the worst had no power." She paused. She said, "It's a protection, it's also a cage." Margaret said, "Mama." Ruth said, "You figured it out. That's the thing, not everyone does. You caught yourself before it cost you everything." Margaret said, "I came close." Ruth said, "Close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. You turned around, that's all that matters." They sat together in the August light, the older woman and the younger, the one who had cleaned other people's houses and kept her back straight and raised her children on pride, and the one who had gotten out and gotten lost and found her way back to something true. And the cat returned and settled near their feet, as if it had simply been thinking things over and had decided their company was acceptable after all, and the garden was very quiet and very gold, with the particular quality of late. Summer light that always feels somehow like a memory even as you are in it. It was the kind of afternoon, Margaret thought, that you did not need to do anything with, you just needed to be in it. On the drive home she thought about everything that had almost happened. The lawyer's consultation that had not progressed past the first call, the case that had not been built, the confrontation that had not happened, the story that had almost replaced the real one. She thought about 43 seconds in a mudroom. She thought about a rainy Wednesday evening and a red front door, and a woman who had looked at her and said, "I was wondering when you were going to come." She thought about tea being made in her kitchen for a frightened woman, and a man who had kept a secret out of love and misguided protection and had carried it too long alone and had finally let it down. She thought about the fact that lives are not the stories we tell about them. Lives are messier than stories, less coherent, less directed toward any particular meaning. They turn on small things, on 43 seconds, on whether you open a door or walk back to your car, on whether you ask the direct question or keep building the case in silence, on whether, when the moment comes to look at the person in front of you, you see them or you see your own fear wearing their face. She thought about her daughter saying Grandma Ruth used to say that people who stop talking to each other always think it's the other person's fault. She thought about what it meant to pass something down, not the specific knowledge, but the orientation toward knowledge. The watching, which could be a gift or a trap, the patience, which could be a strategy or a cage, the silence, which could be a form of strength or a form of hiding. All of these things she had inherited from her mother, and all of them could go either way, depending on what they were in service of. She wanted to pass something down to Clara, too. Not the fear that made the watching necessary, not the habit of silence as self-protection. She wanted to pass down the other thing, the thing her mother had taken decades to articulate, and Margaret had learned only recently, in a hospital parking lot and a rainy Wednesday living room and a garden in August. The thing that was harder than watchfulness and more useful than strategy. She wanted to pass down the willingness to ask, just that, just the direct and terrifying and necessary act of turning to the person you love and saying, "Something is wrong, and I need you to tell me what it is," of trusting that the answer, even if it was hard, was better than the story you would build in the absence of it, of choosing the discomfort of truth over the false comfort of assumption. That was the inheritance she wanted to leave. Not pride exactly, not strength exactly, the willingness to look directly at the real thing rather than the imagined one, even when the real thing was frightening, especially then. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the sun was going down in that particular way it did in Ohio in August, turning everything gold, and then orange, and then a color that had no name. She sat in the car for a moment, not 43 seconds this time, just a breath. Just a moment of sitting with the life that was hers, the real and complicated and not quite the story she had imagined life, and finding it surprisingly enough, more than enough. Robert was in the kitchen when she came in. She could hear him moving around, the sound of the tap, the refrigerator opening, the ordinary evening sounds of a person making their way through the end of their day. She set her bag down on the bench in the hall, the one she had chosen herself, and she stood for a moment, and she breathed. She thought about her mother's hands around a teacup. She thought about Diane's laugh, low and building. She thought about Clara's eyes, too old and entirely her own. She walked into the kitchen. Robert looked up from the counter and said, "How was your mom?" She said she was herself, which is to say she was wonderful and difficult and entirely right about everything. He smiled at that, the smile she knew, the real one. She said, "What are you making?" He said, "I thought that chicken thing." She said, "I'll do the potatoes." And she crossed to the counter and started to peel, and the kitchen was warm and the light was the right kind of light, and outside the window the neighborhood was settling into its evening the way it always did. And it was not a perfect life. It was not a story with a clean ending. It was simply a life with everything that meant, and she was in it, present and watching, and this time watching the right things. And it was, she thought, gathering the potatoes into a bowl. It was going to be all right. If this story moved something in you, if you felt it somewhere real, then subscribe to this channel right now and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next. Every week there is a new story here, stories about ordinary people who carry impossible things and find their way through. Stories that remind you that the most dramatic moments in a life are often not the ones you expected, and that the most important choices are sometimes the ones made in 43 seconds of silence, in the way you turn and walk back to your car, in the willingness to knock on a red door in the rain, in the decision to say something is wrong, and I need you to tell me what it is. Subscribe. Stay. Because the next story is already waiting, and it is the kind that changes how you see the one you are living.